Young girl married an 80-year-old millionaire, only to discover his hidden truth. The ornate gates of the mansion creaked open as Clara's car pulled up the cobblestone driveway, its tires crunching against the gravel. Dressed in a modest white gown that her mother had sewn by hand, she stepped out into a world she never imagined herself entering. Before she stood Edward DeLancey, an 80-year-old millionaire with a piercing gaze that could unearth secrets. Beside him loomed his estate, a sprawling, ivy-draped manor that whispered stories of a bygone era. Clara's breath hitched, her heart racing not from love, but from the weight of her decision. She had married a man older than her grandfather, not for romance, but to save her family from ruin. What she didn't know was that beneath Edward's austere exterior lay a truth far darker and more complex than she could ever have fathomed. The question burned in her mind: had she traded her freedom for a life she might never truly understand? Clara had grown up in a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, a town where dreams were often as weathered as the clapboard houses. The youngest of 3 siblings, she had always been the one who carried hope like a lantern, even when her family's fortunes began to dim. Her father's health had failed first, the robust farmer succumbing to a relentless illness that left him bedridden. Then came the mounting medical bills, piling up like snowdrifts in a bitter winter, followed by the foreclosure notice that threatened to take the only home they had ever known. The DeLanceys were the town's whispered about dynasty, wealthy, reclusive, and shrouded in mystery. Edward DeLancey, the family patriarch, had rarely been seen in public since his wife's passing decades earlier. Some said he'd gone mad with grief, others that he was consumed by his vast business empire. What no one could deny was that he possessed the power to bend Cedar Ridge to his will. Clara's introduction to Edward had been orchestrated by Mrs. Whitmore, a well-meaning but meddlesome neighbor who saw matchmaking as her divine calling. Edward, it seemed, was seeking companionship in his twilight years, and Mrs. Whitmore thought Clara's youthful optimism could bring life to his somber existence. Clara resisted at first, balking at the idea of marrying a man old enough to be her great-grandfather. But when the bank's final warning arrived, and her mother's tear-streaked face became a nightly sight, Clara saw no other choice. Edward had offered a proposition: marry him, and he would settle her family's debts. Standing now at the threshold of her new life, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a story far bigger than her own. The grandeur of the DeLancey estate loomed behind her like a stage set for secrets yet to unfold. And as she met Edward's inscrutable gaze, she couldn't help but wonder if she had just sealed her fate, or begun to unravel his. The first night at the DeLancey estate was both unsettling and surreal. After the hurried courthouse ceremony, Edward had insisted on a quiet dinner in the manor's grand dining room. Clara sat at one end of the impossibly long table, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she listened to the rhythmic tick of the antique grandfather clock. Across from her, Edward's pale, weathered face was barely illuminated by the chandelier's dim light. The staff, all impeccably dressed and eerily silent, moved through the room like shadows. The meal was exquisite, but Clara's appetite had long since vanished. "You look troubled, my dear," Edward said, his deep voice breaking the uneasy silence. Clara flinched, realizing she had been staring at her untouched plate. She forced a smile. "It's just been a long day," she replied, her voice thin. Edward's gray eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than she was comfortable with, but he nodded, as though satisfied with her answer. "You'll find this house has its quirks," he said cryptically, taking a measured sip of wine. "But in time, I hope you'll see it as your home." After dinner, Clara was shown to her room by Margaret, the housekeeper, whose stern demeanor and clipped tone offered little comfort. The room was luxurious, with heavy velvet curtains, gilded furniture, and an opulent canopy bed, but it felt cold and uninviting, much like the rest of the estate. As Margaret left, she hesitated at the door. "If you hear anything unusual in the night, Mrs. DeLancey," she said, her eyes darting to the shadows, "I wouldn't worry. This house makes noises, old wood and drafts, you understand." Clara barely had time to process the odd warning before the door clicked shut, leaving her alone. She tried to settle herself, unpacking a few belongings and changing into a nightgown, but unease prickled at the back of her neck. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination, the nerves of a new bride in an unfamiliar place. But as the night deepened, the noises grew more distinct. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hall, too deliberate to be the house's natural creaks. A whispering sound, low and indistinct, seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Unable to shake her fear, Clara lit a candle and ventured into the corridor. The flickering light cast long, shifting shadows on the ornate wallpaper. The footsteps had stopped, but the whispering persisted, leading her toward a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a faint golden light spilling through the crack. As she approached, her pulse quickened. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, when a voice from within made her heart stop. "She's perfect, Edward," it said, low and sinister. "She'll do nicely." Clara stumbled back, the candle flickering wildly. Her first instinct was to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She had walked into Edward's world willingly, but now she wasn't so sure she could walk back out. The following days at the DeLancey estate felt like a waking dream, one that teetered between grandeur and dread. Clara struggled to adjust to her new life, each interaction with Edward leaving her with more questions than answers. He was kind in a distant, almost perfunctory way, asking after her comfort and ensuring her needs were met, yet his gaze often carried a flicker of something darker, a weight of secrets he had no intention of sharing. The house itself seemed to conspire against her peace. The strange noises Margaret had warned her about persisted. At night, Clara would wake to the sound of faint whispers, too soft to make out words, but unmistakably present. Once, she thought she saw a shadow move across the hallway outside her room, but when she opened the door, she found nothing but the dim glow of the sconces. Each day, she resolved to dismiss her fears as nerves or imagination, yet each night, they returned, stronger than before. It was on the fourth night that Clara decided she couldn't simply ignore the house's oddities any longer. She had to know what was happening. That evening, after another strained dinner with Edward, she feigned exhaustion and excused herself to her room early. Once alone, she waited, her heart pounding as the hours ticked by. When the house had grown silent, she crept into the hallway, a lantern trembling in her hand. Her footsteps were soft on the Persian runner as she made her way toward the west wing, a section of the house that Edward had explicitly told her was off-limits. Clara's curiosity, however, outweighed her fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secrets Edward was keeping lay behind one of those heavy oak doors. As she reached the corridor, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, more distinct now. They seemed to drift from a door at the very end of the hall. Clara approached it cautiously, her pulse thundering in her ears. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see a faint, flickering light. Pushing it open with a trembling hand, she stepped inside. The room was unlike anything she had seen in the rest of the estate. Dusty shelves lined the walls, crammed with books and strange artifacts. A large desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with papers, candles, and a curious glass orb that seemed to pulse faintly with light. Clara's eyes were drawn to the orb, its glow hypnotic. She reached out, but before her fingers could touch it, a voice shattered the silence. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, my dear." Clara whirled around to see Edward standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them as heavy as the air in the room. I couldn't sleep," Clara stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard noises." Edward's eyes flicked to the orb, then back to her. "The house is old. It has its peculiarities. But you should not be here." He stepped into the room, his towering presence filling the space. Gently but firmly, he took her arm and led her back into the hallway, closing the door behind them. "There are parts of this house best left undisturbed," he said, his tone soft but final. "For your safety, Clara." His words, though seemingly protective, sent a chill down her spine. What could be so dangerous within the walls of the house? And why did Edward seem so intent on keeping her from finding out? The next morning, Clara resolved to confront him. Over breakfast, she set down her teacup with a determined clink. "Edward," she began, "there's something you're not telling me about this house." He looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm. "What do you mean?" "The whispers, the things I've seen," she said, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "I deserve to know what's going on." Edward sighed, setting the paper aside. "Clara, you've been through a great deal of change in a short amount of time. It's natural for your mind to play tricks on you." "Don't patronize me," Clara shot back, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "Something is happening in this house, and I won't be kept in the dark." For a moment, Edward regarded her in silence, his gray eyes unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "If you wish to know the truth, meet me in the study tonight." The day crawled by as Clara anxiously awaited the evening. When the appointed time came, she made her way to the study, her nerves fraying with each step. Edward was already there, seated in a leather armchair by the fire. A decanter of brandy and 2 glasses sat on the table beside him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Clara obeyed, her hands clenched in her lap. Edward poured them each a glass, handing one to her. He sipped him before speaking. "The DeLancey estate is more than just a home," he began. "It is a repository of knowledge, of power. My ancestors were not merely businessmen, they were scholars, explorers of realms beyond the ordinary." Clara frowned, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Realms beyond the ordinary?" Edward nodded. "Some might call it the occult. Others might call it madness. But the truth is, this house contains things that defy explanation. Things that can be dangerous if mishandled." Clara's mind raced, struggling to process his words. "And the whispers? The shadows?" "Echoes," Edward said, his tone grave. "Residual energy from the past. Not all of it is benign." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to protect you," Edward said. "And because I hoped you wouldn't need to know. But it seems the house has other plans." Clara sat back, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had married Edward to save her family, but now she found herself bound to a world she barely understood, one filled with secrets, shadows, and whispers that hinted at dangers yet to come. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that rattled the very bones of the DeLancey estate. The wind howled through the corridors, and the once soothing flicker of candlelight cast menacing shadows across the walls. Clara clutched the glass orb, its glow now pulsating wildly in her hands, as Edward's voice echoed from across the room. "Put it down, Clara," he commanded, his tone sharp and laced with desperation. "You don't understand what you're holding." But Clara didn't lower the orb. She couldn't. Its warmth coursed through her palms, tingling like static, and for the first time since entering the house, she felt like she wasn't just being watched, she was connected to something bigger. "You've lied to me since the moment I arrived here," Clara shot back, her voice trembling but resolute. "What is this? What is it for?" Edward stepped closer, his towering frame silhouetted by the fireplace. "That is a legacy, Clara. A power passed down through my family for generations, bound to the estate. It's not meant for you to use." "Not meant for me," she repeated, her grip tightening. "You dragged me into this house, into this marriage, without telling me the truth. And now you're telling me what I'm not allowed to touch." The whispers Clara had heard for days now filled the room, louder and more coherent. They didn't just surround her, they spoke directly to her. "He's afraid. He fears you will see." Edward's face darkened. "You don't know what you're meddling with. That orb holds memories, energy, and truths that are not meant for anyone unprepared. It will destroy you. Clara's voice rose to match his. Maybe it's time someone else decided what to do with your family's secrets. With a defiant glare, she pressed her fingers against the orb's smooth surface. The light intensified, enveloping the room in a brilliant, blinding glow. Edward lunged forward, but it was too late. The orb's energy surged through Clara, and she felt herself being pulled into a maelstrom of visions. Images flashed before her, Edward as a young man, his hands trembling as he first touched the orb, his ancestors standing in ritual circles, chanting incantations to harness its power, and shadows of those who had been consumed by its force, their faces contorted in anguish. Among the chaos, a singular truth became clear: the orb wasn't just a repository of knowledge. It was a prison for something darker, something alive. And it was watching her. Clara gasped as the visions released her, the orb now dim and cool in her hands. She stumbled back, her legs weak, and met Edward's panicked gaze. "Now you understand," he said, his voice hollow. "Why it must remain hidden. Why you must leave it alone." But Clara shook her head. "No. You've kept this secret for too long. The house, the whispers, they aren't just echoing. They're warnings. Whatever is in this orb isn't just bound to the estate. It's bound to you." Edward took a step back, the mask of control slipping from his face. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Clara said, her voice steadier now. "This thing has taken your family's lives one by one. And now it's your turn, isn't it? That's why you brought me here. To keep it from taking you." Edward's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Clara's hands tightened around the orb as she stepped toward the fireplace, its flames casting a golden halo around her. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, and she realized they weren't guiding her to preserve the orb. They were begging her to end it. "Clara, don't." Edward's voice cracked, his composure crumbling. But Clara, with every ounce of strength she had hurled the orb into the fire. The room erupted in light and sound, a deafening roar shaking the walls. Edward screamed as a shadowy figure emerged from the flames, its form writhing before dissipating into smoke. And then, silence. When the light faded, the room was still. Clara stood trembling, her eyes fixed on the charred remains of the orb. Edward was slumped against the wall, his face pale and his breaths ragged. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice was heavy with uncertainty. "Whatever it was, it's gone." Edward met her gaze, his eyes filled with something between relief and sorrow. You've done what no DeLancey could. But at what cost?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't know. All she knew was that the house was finally silent.